Hello everyone, today we talk about 14th century Scottish infantry. As you know, during this century, especially the first half of it, the Scottish armies were among the European protagonists of the infantry victories over cavalry, which is a topic that incidentally I've been studying a bit for another country at this point, and gotta give that there are interesting studies. One is infantry warfare from De Vries. That was actually his PhD thesis. It's a very interesting study because it's a purely tactical analysis. I can't tell you I fully agree with everything it's written, like even just the method, but it's objectively a very good one, and that's fascinating because you can see for all these various victories that include, famously the Flemish, the Swiss, then the English with their actually unique system, and the Scots as well. This purely tactical measurement of the infantry quality and effectiveness on its own, right? You can see, for example, the Swiss at this point are pretty good, right, with their infantrymen, but still they obtain very important victories. For example, ambushing the enemy where he was not yet deployed, or exploiting the terrain specifically. So the author makes all of these analyses to see what was effect, because there are actually infantry victories that do not tell us precisely these things had happened in a pitched battle, like it could be like at Courtrai and so on, that the infantry would have withstood effectively the charges of enemy cavalry, or heavy cavalry specifically. Well, the Scots actually, as far as I've seen up to this point, we made just a video on the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and that's very interesting because it's a prodrome for the the Scottish infantry victories of the 14th century, but still it's not like the English basically screwed up with a maneuver that at least it was a time miscalculation. They even fought well technically, so that's infantry. Scottish infantry was very important in there, especially en masse, to attack the disorderly English and achieve victory. But still, that's, for example, in fact, a good battle that showing that we don't know in a normal situation whether they would have won or not. Also considering the Scots had been defeated a few times before in that way by English cavalry. So you see how non-linear, not progressive, not positivistic the whole thing can be interpreted. But we gotta give indeed that in the early 14th century the Scots achieve a big deal thanks to the solidity of their infantries, like that they are decisive, and that's what really matters. Infantry as an arm in the Scottish wars really makes its own show. Not always, because also the English at that point began to actually, between Edward the First and Edward the Third, including Edward the Second, there was this gradual understanding that from the English side that the importance of infantry was increasing, and there is a specifically doctrinal formula that eventually is completed and fulfilled by Edward the Third that will be functional up to the end of the 100 Years' War. Would achieve it's one basically possibly the greatest, most effective tactic in military history in terms of symmetry, in the sense that, of course, we can't make comparison throughout all history, but at least if you look at the numbers, especially in English numerical inferiority compared to the French and so on, that you don't find in any other period in history anything like that in terms of battle outcomes. It's pure mathematics, right? There is no doubt about that. And actually I said this multiple times. At some point one of you asked me, but why, how? Well, maybe I will make a video at some point to explain better what I mean, right? We could say even more specific things like what was the strongest army in history in terms of costs benefits ratio from an economical point of view. Easily the Dutch army between the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century, but that's also something you can't calculate. Then this has nothing to do with says what was the greatest army in history. It doesn't make sense, right? You have always to contextualize, but objectively we gotta give it to the English that had their military geniuses definitely in their history, and excuse me, Edward III is definitely the most complete and the greatest one. And well, a part of that is surely also thanks to the experience matured during the Scottish Wars, so that in fact also the Scots eventually would suffer of that of the effectiveness of that tactics in spite of their good infantry. And here today we talk basically not much about their tactics or anything, but this video is specifically about the Scottish foot soldier of the 14th century. That is a bit of equipment, and yes, tactics, and as much it's considering the intrinsic, we could say, quality of these troopers really were, but we would have to give a much more background and context, and I hope to do that when we will talk about specifically the Scottish army organization during these centuries and the Scottish tactics. We'll make separate videos for that, right? But even from the information about Scottish foot soldiers, we can actually explain a lot quite easily. And one datum that is also very meaningful in terms of ways that can be a protagonist of certain victories in here. Is it really wealth that matters, or what? Really not. I mean, look at the Flemish were among the richest Europeans out there. They achieved Courtrai was amazing. Scotland was definitely not one of the richest countries in Europe, yet they do the same. And this is a very good example comparison to explain how there is a very few deterministic aspects you can use to explain victories after all, and always have to stay focused on the context and what is that truly matters. In general, as always, is the prevalent thing is moral strength, but it's not enough, right? But it's still, in relative terms, the most important thing. And here the example is pretty clear, because although many Scottish men-at-arms, knights, whether fighting whether mounted or dismounted, were equipped identically to their English counterparts, like we could say as any other European knight at the time, especially in Western Europe, if you really want to look at the style maybe of armor, something like that. It is evident that from sources at many levels that most Scottish troops were actually poorly provided with armor, right? In general, yes, the comparison maybe men-at-arms or average guy from even just the lowlands, even those were evidently richer than the highlands, doesn't help. But we have interesting examples also of Scottish knights on average being less equipped, right? It's not a matter of how they were equipped, about military technology, specifically speaking. We made that video about the Gallo-Glycs and other warriors from some of the wildest areas out there of the Celtic fringe, having being poorer, but still if they bought an armor, that they bought it from the last place. In that sense, they didn't have any technological gap, and that's not what makes properly the difference. But we know that, of course, Scotland was basically becoming at this point a properly feudal kingdom, in the sense that before it was just this set of communities that got together, and there was a very few centralization. The reason being naturally that being less wealth in general, and there was less social certification, so the individual communities were more autonomous than other places. I mean, compared with England, that instead was one of the most effective and most centralized for medieval standards countries out there. They had an excellent administration, was a country of ancient unity, we could say, even administratively speaking, and so on. This is also reflected in the army. The Scots were freer, simply, and yet they started this point during the wars of independence naturally also to gain this broader, as war does, right? This increasing centralization, even from a political point of view. And this, however, still shows that their aristocracies, compared to the rest of, say, Europe, could say on average, but even just with England at that point, were poorer, as we have said. So, proportionally, we could say that there was unavoidably a greater importance of of troops from the lower classes in this sense. That explains in good part why Scottish infantry was so important, right? But at the same time, it has not to do much of the equipment of it all, but the collective training, of course, and the broader national cohesion. That at the end of the day is, from a political point of view, what truly makes the difference in that sense. And that's where also the moral dimension emerges, because that's really what the unity of intent, right? It's not if a fighter is equipped in a certain way, or it's like, no. It's really about how altogether you're able to come on a battlefield and say, we're gonna stand our ground, and we have enough cohesion and determination to go through this. And definitely the Scots show this pretty clearly. We know at the battle, both the battles of Dublin Moor and Halidon Hill, the Scots are described as badly armored, in unvisored helmets. There is the well-known episodes also from Froissart Chronicles, where during the bit later here, the 1385 expedition, their French allies brought over for them 1,200 armors, quote, which were distributed among the Scots knights to the great delight of the recipients, who were otherwise ill equipped. And this is interesting, of course, because of the mere information. In fact, the Scottish knights had less equipment compared to the English. But I find it interesting the detail that this French equipment actually came from the one captured from the Maillotin 2 years before. Basically, in 1382, there were these people that were known as the Maillotin, which takes the name after the hammers, the maillet in French, right? That these guys had taken from the arsenal of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. They had risen in the city on March the 1st, 1382, because of taxes. And this is also fascinating because it shows you, like, a city like Paris, like you could compare with, I don't know, the Flemish city-states, how they had rebelled, for example, to the same French. The material wealth that starting being accumulated by cities. And it's interesting that they were equipped with hammers. But also here, as far as the equipment that was brought to the Scots, evidently armor as well. So it's a combination, of course. These guys were equipped with hammers. That is some of the most effective weapons that you can employ against armor. And at the same time, they were equipped in turn in an armored fashion. This is interesting because, I don't know, it's witnessed even in the Italian city-states during these revolts of people that maybe had never, as commoners, had never taken up arms in their hands, but they had their magazines, their stock filled with all these weapons, right? This is typical. Actually, you could find it even in on average French towns and villages. The kingdom said, you shouldn't be armed because, of course, major feudal states were accelerating the process of disarming of the populations, but they still were full of this stuff. And it's interesting that this equipment goes from commoners, basically. Well, the Hôtel de Ville, okay, was also for other troops, meant to equip other troops, but at the same time, it's we have this kind of equipment that was used both by commoners in this specific occasions, at least in the city, urban revolts and things like that, that fits knights as well. right? And it's pretty fascinating. Then, naturally, Scotland began, like any other policy at that time, to regulate more closely. Here we are in the 14th century. There is an important amount of material wealth, in spite of the general crisis. These are bulkier systems they had in the previous centuries, and they start issuing that there's an increasing control in the population also in here, and the monarchy emanates this, in this case of Scotland, the Statutes of Arms, issued during the 14th as well as the 15th century, multiple ones, of course. Of course, listing the demanded equipment. And this was originally issued by Robert Bruce in 1318, so it began fairly early, and that remained the base for the later equipment required, and at least for the 14th century it remained effective, right? As we were saying before, it's not, equipment in itself, it's not really what makes the difference. It still helps though. And during the 14th century, it's not that there are devastating technological changes or whatever, so it was already the biggest deal in pre-industrial society was having the freaking armor in the first place, which was already an enormous deal. And we know, of course, that a bit like in the pre-industrial average, the situation was actually tragic compared to the ideal equipment issued by the statutes, and in particular, we think, especially in Scotland, because of the aforementioned material shortage altogether. So this statute of Robert Bruce 1318 required that a man with 10 pounds of movable property should equip himself with an acton, that is the acton, a bassinet, gauntlets, swords, and spear, right? Which is a very good equipment altogether, considering the times and places. In other countries, yeah, it's basically the same. Yet we know that, in fact, the average Scottish infantryman was way less equipped, way worse equipped, let's say. And for a bit more of money, they were issued also to provide a hooded iron jack, that is fundamentally a mail corselet, plate gauntlets, an iron knapskull, so was called, and so on. Naturally, there was this gradual increase of, an obvious increase of equipment on the base of the wealth availability. And this statute would therefore seem to have basically confirmed the current practice, since we know from the accounts of English chroniclers, at least, that the Scottish foot at the Battle of Bannockburn were equipped with helmets, shields, and light but sword-proof armor, axe at side and spear in hand, right? Which is good equipment. And in terms of European average, that fits pretty well. The sword-proof armor is fascinating, because at least we think that the first ranks of the phalanx, let's say, of the skill term, that, as we'll see in a while, is not even properly a specific formation, but just the array, that the way it was in which order it was, the close order of it, but at least were heavily armored. I mean, this was the norm throughout not just the Middle Ages, because of course, as we'll see, Scottish infantry was, like all infantry at that time, especially, that didn't have dramatic offensive mobility capabilities, vulnerable to missile, right? And that's how also the English start, thinking through their how to surpass certain problems and develop their specific tactics. So, but the idea of having a armored front line is pretty much standard at the time. Scottish statutes of the 15th century were slightly more demanding. The 15th century is time of greatest armoredness, let's say, in military history altogether. From the 16th century through the development of firearms, armor gradually decreases. So Scotland was, as you know, also interfered with the 100 Years' War. I mean, it was actually heavily involved. Even so, French and English armies at the time were very well armored at that for European standards, and so that they gravitated around this whole thing. And this 15th century statutes expect a higher proportion of plate armor, as it was naturally developing at the time. It had basically taken over mail. Talking about defensive weapon, this is important because we talk often and mostly about pikemen, right? Or at least those who made the most of the job on the field in terms especially of defense from cavalry, were unavoidably equipped with pikes, right? Remember always this, that you can't find all these terrific weapons on the European battlefields at the time, pole arms and others like blunt weapons, like, I don't know, look at the Göttendag or the Swiss halberd in the previous version, and the same actually Scottish axes, the double hand axes that are famous since Pictish times. But the only thing that actually stops a cavalry charge, right, that stops it at least, then you can attack it with other weapons. But when it's stopped, but the only thing that actually works is pike. There's no other thing. There's no other weapon that stops it, right? You can use maybe missile weapons to laterally soften up to the ranks, but without pikes at this point, especially in these armies that are fundamentally based on infantry, especially in the first half of the century, that the pike is the one that's going to do the job, the only one. And naturally, pikes had always existed. They would naturally keep existing. It's just at this point in history, they come now for reasons that we can't digress on excessively, but a greater amount on the field, especially in these countries that had risen pretty fast during the 13th century. They had lower middle classes that had gotten stronger, so they had also demographically increased, so there was simply more availability. They had more wealth, and they were fighting in this case for either their independence or in general for their freedom in a way or another. Also, if it was even here we're talking about foreign domination, but of course this could happen just from a social point, for social reasons. The pike is the deal with the pike that it requires in order to be effective, an important training, right? An important cohesion. It's not before the mid 15th century actually that you see professionals, enough at least professional troops equipped with pikes in the range of the thousands that will make the difference in really with cavalry for good, historically speaking, or at least for what the context at that time was. At this point there are, but it's still it's not enough. You have these infantry to stop cavalry by themselves. These infantry, as always, they have to be determined in a way that it's still not enforced by a state, right? The monarchies still do not have the strength nor the interest actually to arm and train professionally thousands of commoners, right? The only ones that actually start making this are basically the English, also because they went destroying across the sea out of their own country. So there were many reasons for that. We're talking, of course, of the several thousand longbowmen that sided the English men at arms during the chevauchée in France, but that's the exception. And here about the Scots, we're talking about, as we were saying before, commoners that really go there for it, right? They surely are commanded to do so, like it's not they were freemen doing whatever they liked, but still they had an evident interest to defend, to safeguard, in part their interests as an independent country. And not only, because of course there were those that really did it just for personal interest, but as in any country in any time. So the spear, which is at least what a pike is, just a long spear by definition, was probably, as far as we understand, because I don't think there are dramatic archaeological there is dramatic archaeological evidence of this, between 12-14 feet in length throughout this, not just the 14th century, but throughout all the 15th as well. So we're talking about decimal system 3.6 to 4.2 meters, right, which is pretty standard Europe-wide. Scottish Parliamentary Edicts of 1471 and 1481, so at the end of the Middle Ages, this period, recommend respectively the adoption of 6 Ls, right? The Scottish L being 37 inches, and 6 Ls would be something like 18 feet and a half, that is something like 5.5 meters, right? Or a minimum of 5 Ls, that is 15 and a half feet, that is 4.7 meters, as a standard for Scottish bikes, right? But we think, as all issues, all legal things related, that this stuff was just a prescription, but the measure was unsuccessful, right? And it seems, in fact, that in Scottish warfare, pikes of this length were being introduced only in the form imported by the Swiss pikes pretty late in time, at the time of the Flodden campaign that we'll see at some point in 1513. This is also important because it makes you realize that the success of Scottish infantry during the first half of the 14th century was, of course, related not much to any greater proportion of pikes compared to any other European infantry, but just maybe the availability of troops and their determination altogether, mostly, and of course important command, leadership, and so on. And we will speak of that later, relatively, especially to Robert Bruce. We made a video, I don't remember actually where, but about the St. Andrew's Cross, right? This was for recognition purposes, the Scottish soldiers' requirement, and the White Cross of St. Andrew's before and behind the chest. This measure is first recorded in connection with the 1385 expedition, right? The Scots bore St. Andrew's, the flag with St. Andrew's Cross much earlier than that, but as far as the uniformation of the troops was, you understand, in the Middle Ages there's no thing like properly modern uniformation, but it was starting being, especially for certain picked troops and so on, pretty heterogeneously altogether, considering how armies were assembled, but still importantly, for as a reflection of the development of the Scottish armies. And interestingly, there were also French allied troops of the Scots under Jean de Vienne that were also expected to comply this measure bearing St. Andrew's Cross. There is another interesting detail that is also an important Scot-Gaelic tradition, that is the use of the horn, war horns. Froissart writes, quote, "When they, the Scots, beat us assembled together in arms, the footmen beareth about their necks a horn in the manner of a hunter, some great, some big, some small, and of all sorts." Right? And it was said at the time that the sound of these horns altogether could be listened by the English 4 miles away during the day and 6 miles away by night, right? Which had an important effect on, boosting the Scottish morale, and definitely a detrimental one on the enemy one. This is interesting just for thinking at other videos we made about military music and all these sensorial effects that, in my opinion, are some of the most overlooked elements in military history today. We try to rationalize, to technologize, to modernize, but think of what it means just, a visual an acoustic experience on the field, or not just on the field like as we've seen now, and all the tradition that actually lays behind it from a cultural point of view, but also from an anthropological point of view. So, speaking of formations, battle formations, I would spend just a word about the skill term or skill turn that simply means shield wall. And there is this idea from that derives as a bit of a misinterpretation of Gisborough's Chronicle, relatively to the passage about the Battle of Falkirk, in which basically the skill term is associated to these circles or hollow rings of Scottish pikemen that becomes a bit, stereotypical of the skill term. This demi-circles or circle formation is to be found, I don't know, even in the Flemish armies, elsewhere. It's mostly present. It's not such a frequent thing in military history, but it's definitely exemplificative of only infantry armies, let's say, at some point, or dismounted ones that, however, when they are surrounded, so they don't have their sides or back covered by some obstacle, as what they would preferably search for. But if they were caught in the open, or there was a counterattack, they abandoned their positions after having counterattacked before in turn. These guys would enclose themselves in these rings, but the skill term is technically not that, at least in terms how it was used. Surely it was used to important effect. There were very important battles. Think about Bannockburn, with the importance of the circles there, with the English cavalry going around to spot the weakest part of the line where to charge, and all the, aside from behind the pikemen, all the other melee Scotsmen, following, the English cavalry around to make mass in the place where they would have struck, right? So these are important things, of course, but they're not specifically distinctive of Scottish tactics. Probably Scotland, I'll go as far saying that in Europe, at least in Western Europe, in this specific context, is probably the country that made more use of it. But once again, it was something more general that also other infantries would do. It's just difficult to find infantries that can perform that so frequently, and that's a testament. It's another hint that speaks for actually the effectiveness of Scottish infantry. This is even more important considering, in perspective, the fact that in order to make all this, you need enough training. Okay, so Scottish infantry, as we've seen, were definitely not some of the most professional or trained and so on. So the fact that they could perform that speaks for their level of internal cohesion, which is very important, and that can't do, or even where maybe other trained troops can't, or they're not preferably used like that. In any case, it's mostly the important numbers of infantry that also oblige, but that's an obvious thing. The same infantry to be more dynamic, to be more performing, because that's what you have, and then you're there to win or die. So, right, you don't have many choices at that point, and yet it's not necessarily gonna be successful. The case of the Scots, many times it was, multiple times at least. And I should stress, I make this specific remarks to explain to you that it's not normal in here, even in this first half of the 14th century, to conceive infantry alone doing this stuff, right? For in any country, like there wasn't any country that said, okay, let's fight with infantry, we're fine with that, right? If you had nothing else, like, I don't know, the Flemish communes, that they had just infantry. Yeah, they had few cavalry, but it was virtually an influent. Then, yeah, it's all infantry, but it's not because if they had cavalry, would have liked to use it, right? And the same goes for the Scots. It's not that they ever abandoned cavalry or they ever thought they had just to fight with infantry. It's just what they had, and that's mostly what military history is all about, right? Because in the first place, some of the most difficult things here from a political, strategical point of view is to even have the men to do something. So once you have them, you have to make them work in a way. So that's how eventually things happen, right? But as far as the meaning of skill term and the actual formation that it represented, we have Barber, that is other author, that does not call the Scottish infantry formations at Bannockburn skill terms, right? But does use the word to describe instead the disordered English, quote, for all their divisions were together in a skill term, right? This is interesting because it means that the English army, let's say the English divisions that surely existed within the same army, I mean, there's no doubt about that, but they were all crowded together. So like normally battle lines, battle divisions were separated even by several hundred meters to be maneuverable, not to create this domino effects in case one division collapsed and took away the others in the rout. So that is an interesting quote because it explains exactly the concept of what the skill term means. That is, mostly the thickness of the order, the closeness of the order. And in this case, it's even brought at another level that of the internal array of the same divisions, but all the divisions all together. So that makes you understand how flexible the term is and how medieval ones actually were. And that's very, very important when you analyze these accounts to understand that there is nothing categorical. We are in pre-Linnaean times. There is nothing like that encyclopedical positivistic categorical take on the meaning of words. You have to interpret them in a way, but the meaning is way more natural than you think. It's just we moderns that overcomplicate things often in our minds. So basically skill term means crowded together in a bunch, right? In this case, perhaps specifically without formation. While Sir Thomas Gray describes the Scots advancing at Bannockburn as, quote, all aligned in Skiltern, which instead here stands for aligned in close order, right? So you have two orders that use the same term. In one, it's the idea of this English army packed all in one bunch without particular order. The other one is this Scottish army well aligned in close order, like you would actually have infantry, like at Scottish infantry at Bannockburn was. We will make a video, of course, about the battle Bannockburn really did to withstand English charges, cavalry charges. So, other than troops in close order, no particular formation, weapon, or tactic is implied by the use of the word skill term, right? And I must tell you that I fell into mistake myself, right? Because honestly, before reading certain stuff, I didn't know. I was aware that I didn't specifically know what it meant, actually, but just disclaimer, do not think the skill term is any specific thing. It's not circles. It's not hedgehog formation either necessarily, because it doesn't necessarily even refer to pikemen or whatever, right? It's just a way of phrasing a close order of sort, and it's very flexible as a term. Which doesn't mean that, however, Scottish infantry wasn't particularly, deployed in close order. On the contrary, it was, right? So, and that was also what made its fortune, but also that is standard of how infantries would, in these specific generations, start daring to cope with cavalry after 200 years of basically of predominion on the battlefields, at least in Western Europe. Speaking of other aspects of Scottish infantrymen at this point, so as we've seen, infantrymen represented the backbone of Scottish armies, right? And we think they were mostly pikemen. As we were saying before, I'm not entirely sure of that. I think that actually most of them weren't, because pikes are necessary just in the front ranks at the end of the day. If you look at other armies at the time, like the Flemish or the Italians or whatever, they had the first ranks, and that's normal. There were a few altogether. If you pick the numbers of the armies, like they could have been maybe 1/10, something like that. So I presume actually that the Scottish. I can be wrong, but I don't think there is any reason to believe they were anything different from that. And we know, however, in fact, that there was this depth of 6 ranks, which is also pretty similar, in fact, to the ones of the other Europeans. It was either 6 or 8, not much more. Maybe, yes, for the Flemish a bit more. But once again, I don't think they were all pike, right? There is no... I can be wrong. I can't tell you about the Scots specifically, but for other armies, we're pretty... Yeah, there could be even up to 6 ranks of pikemen. I don't know, but considering also the length of the pikes and the general training of these troops, I don't think it would have been even necessary. Like, it would have been 3-4 ranks of pikemen, then immediately men with blunt weapons in the rear, or maybe other lances and so on, but something, let's say, less cumbersome, because that's actually what the problem of those long spears, the pikes that we have seen before, actually was, that they were difficult to maneuver. In fact, maybe here I don't have the example for the Scots, but presumably in counterattack, because even infantry is counterattacked at some point, abandoning the array. For example, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Scottish infantry attacked in a somewhat disorderly way, or at least, let's say better, they advanced fast to attack the English while they were still crossing the river, and they didn't have enough training to maintain cohesion. We know that, and that was not even important, because at that point it was the mass that really did make the difference. So even in here, let's assume you managed to defeat English cavalry that has just charged, and you want to press on the enemy. Well, if you're a pikeman and there at that point you have this, I don't know, 5 meters pike, you have just to run on a shaking enemy. You throw away the pike, because that's mostly for defense, and you pass to the side weapon, as we've seen before, the axes that were also like a Scottish thing traditionally there, which are very good also to finish the knights that you have overthrown on the ground. And that's also very important, because we have actual accounts of individual teams or even individual warriors coming out of the pike line of pikemen, because there were also, of course, there was enough space in between also to make some troops pass. Like, it was not literally a continuous line, and no, that's not a weakness for a formation, because to exploit a gap between enemy divisions, you must have enough space even for yourself. Like, it's not you find a gap, that's the weak spot, you're charging. No, it didn't work like that. When you charge, especially with cavalry, you don't waste that for that, because eventually cannot matter what do you charge into nothingness. You don't pass in the middle if it's too narrow, right? If you charge against these things, you charge frontally to smash into the line, right? And that's what they actually did, right? The myth that these guys didn't charge straight is in fact a myth. Of course, there were many attempts. They didn't do it straight away, but the concept of a cavalry charge is exactly the shock you have to. It is true that, though, many infantries would give up even before impact, because that's actually mostly the psychological aspect of it rather than the physical impact. But you break before horse and horseman smashes into you, which is the alternative. Well, these infantries had enough cohesion, as we were saying, to stand their ground and to repel cavalry charges. So these guys would come out of the pikemen with this double hand axes, and smash into the English knights trample under horses, stuff like that, right? And it was pretty standard in European warfare in any army, right? And that's where you would see most of blunt weapons. Here, I even inserted a beautiful picture, which is, I think, from the Battle of Bannockburn. I think it was the second of the video. You see a Scottish infantryman, actually 3 here account, with falchions that actually are not good at all against armored opponents. Like, falchions against armor, it sucks, right? You really want to have things like maces, double hand axes, pretty thing that really smash into the gap, because if the falchion blade against armor simply destroys itself, right? Or at least it's not effective. It ruins itself and nothing else. But even if there was normal, there were guys that, I don't know, there were naturally instances of Scottish cavalry versus versus English cavalry, and from both sides, guys that followed the knights on foot, and with knights went under the horses to disembowel them, things like that, right? That was also normal, pretty much everywhere. There is this picture, generally speaking, given by chroniclers about Scottish infantry. The Scottish phalanx, let's call it in this way, is an impenetrable barrier bristling with iron-tipped pikes to the heavily armored English cavalry. It seemed impenetrable, right? The whole deal of cavalry there was to sense where exactly to charge, finding the weakest spot, and to try to charge. And it was a very complicated thing to do that only a knight had the expertise of doing. But of course, even here, there's nothing deterministic. A cavalry charge is something very difficult to perform, and just professionals can do, but it can fail evidently as well. As we've already said, Scottish infantry was generally vulnerable to missile weapons. Think about longbows, crossbows, as at this point missile infantry is increasing in importance. At the Battle of Falkirk, for example, the English managed to break the Scottish infantry after having it soften it up with longbowmen. So, because evidently that's easy to shoot into the mass, into the thickly packed formation, and to hit, because also on battlefields there is a very few of terms of precision fire. If not at a very close range, if you're hitting maybe knights in certain weak spots, etc. But that's something very, very, very specific. It didn't happen more than much. Most of the missile tactics were launching these volleys all together to maximize the effect of the disorder at the moment. The volley hit all together, which is way more effective than shooting the same exact amount of missile, but in a diluted time, even if it's the same time of between a volley and another. And that's what really mattered, all right? And that's what really helped cavalry, in fact, in combined armed tactics. Sir Thomas Gray tells us that, quote, the Scots had taken a lesson from the Flemings, who before that at Courtrai defeated on foot the power of France. Famously enough, as we were saying before, in 1302. We made a video about the Battle of Courtrai recently. So this is an interesting question, is there a connection between the success of Scottish infantry and the Flemish victory at Courtrai, that was objectively the first one in time during the 14th century, and also the biggest, most clamorous one, considering altogether the loss, especially the flower of French cavalry and the broader meaning of it? Well, sure, yes, but Europeans weren't, both the Flemish and the Italians, for example, but even the Scots, if you look at what we've seen before, the Stirling Bridge had experiments, and even more in the previous centuries, in the 13th, in the 12th, even the Italians. But yes, but mostly from a moral point of view. This is what I would like to stress. Yes, Courtrai showed really that world could go upside down, that all these hundreds of golden spurs stripped from the corpses of French knights were given to the Virgin of Courtrai. That was the prize of medieval tournament. It was something incredible that these commoners that literally had not taken up arms up to the day before could achieve that. And it was something so empowering, even just the chroniclers tell pretty clearly for the Flemish. Naturally, yes, Flanders and Scotland are not that far after all. There are important contexts, as we see even for the equipment, as we'll see in a while, between Scotland and Flanders and the Hanseatic towns. News traveled, right? That news didn't travel in the Middle Ages is a myth. News traveled pretty damn fast, and and who knew how to exploit them, knew how to do it pretty well and quickly. But as far as the technical part of it, that is to say, oh, look what the Flemish did, let's do it too in terms of using infantry or certain tactics, that is not correct, right? That is a myth that we have invented in modern terms to say that basically there is this progressive evolution of infantry, right? That's false. Like, every army at the time knew actually what the potential of infantry really was, because guess what? Infantry was always used all the time. Knights liked, they of course they disliked, they considered the commoners as subhumans, but they of course knew what the infantry was capable of, and they were actually the ones that were most aware of that, right? Not even the infantries were so aware of themselves as much as the knights were of the infantries, of their capabilities, of their potential, and it was all about combined arms, right? So, I don't know, thinking here the chronicler says that Robert Bruce might have been inspired by Courtrai, yes, but as far as the pikemen were involved, I mean, Robert Bruce of course knew what infantry could do on itself, right? There was no reason to say, okay, let's look at the Flemish specifically. What he would have known as a military aristocrat of the elite of medieval Europe, it of course was that you need, as we were saying before, determination. You need definitely a specific array, a specific order, specific training too, right? The Scottish Wars of Independence bring also this, there was of course, an increase in professionalism at some level, of course. People who would fight for a living in that sense and becoming professionals and being in large numbers, large enough numbers to present this cohesion at some level of the units. That, as we've seen, it doesn't take so many specific pikemen, right? It takes many infantry to stop cavalry, but the important is just having the first ranks of guys you can really trust and keep, and also armor enough, given the hell that those front lines really were. So he knew how to do it, Flemish or not Flemish. He might have been inspired, been morally, uplifted by the possibility of doing something like that, but in imitation, but giving a confidence that objectively in the previous centuries there did not exist in that measure towards infantry. But once again, it's his leadership, it's his political, even before the military capacity, that brought to the Scottish victories during the War of Independence. So, yes, this is, in my opinion, the correct perspective we should look at the thing from. And what is interesting about this, before we were saying that these infantries were fundamentally defensive, which is correct for up to the Swiss reforms in the mid-15th century. Infantry was not meant to charge fundamentally because they didn't have enough collective training to do it, right? They were simply, it's a matter of extraction and simply who trained them and so on. And even the progress, if we can call it like this, in later times has nothing to do with a democratization of warfare, if anything the contrary. Well, the Swiss, yes, as confederates had a bit more of another count, but I mean, they opened to Renaissance warfare. Renaissance warfare is basically proletarians enlisted en masse by princes that had the money, right? That's basically it. In this time, instead, it's really the people that does the thing on its own. But it's important to stress that albeit infantry was not meant to advance, to abandon its positions, it was mostly in a defensive fashion that it was used, and there's really nothing bad into it, right? It doesn't mean it sucks, right? If it makes you win, that's what you wanted. Mission accomplished, right? But at the same time, there are certain contingencies in which you do need infantry to move, especially as far as maneuvers are concerned, which make you earn all the time the time you need, hopefully, and that takes training, of course. And there are examples. The behavior of Moray's pikemen on June the 23rd, 1314, that Bannockburn illustrates not only the Scottish infantry maneuverability, when Moray had been leader also of the Stirling Bridge together with Wallace, which tells you how infantry could take, say, not properly the initiative in this sense, but I mean as an arm on its own, to go even there and meet with horsemen and to try to halt them, to stop them. This is very interesting. I found certain accounts, I will tell at some point, of similar things happening here and there, and that tells you how, even in contexts where actually infantry didn't eventually win altogether as an independent arm, how it was still thought it could be used, and it was used effectively, right? Sometimes even changing front or deploying it as a reserve that was not just meant to attack frontally together with in axis with a battle line, but sometimes, like in here exactly, in the other examples I meant, to go sideways, right? And of course they could maneuver, of course they knew how to change the direction and so on, right? They were just not meant to do it out there in the open without support, right? And that's in fact where also the Scots went, by standing their ground very steadily, firm, without moving, because that was the best way naturally to stop cavalry, not to attack like a fresh cavalry line was ready to countercharge, right? Albeit there are examples here and there, also in European warfare at the time, of infantry literally taking the initiative after the battle, the cavalry lines had exhausted themselves and were resting, and infantry takes over. And that tells you, and attacks them. And maybe, like, cavalry comes after them and takes the victory for them, but the concept is in here that's the moral force and physical force, of course, as well, because exhaustion is a real thing, creates the balance. That's what I would like to leave you with. I mean, the idea that it's never like one or the other that wins. I mean, of course, cavalry has normally the upper hand throughout all this time, in Europe, even in the first half of the 14th century, all these infantry victories, but there are situations in which also other arms can do the thing, and specifically infantry, because aside from missile troops, are basically the skirmishers of the Middle Ages. I mean crossbowmen and longbowmen, etc. That's the ones that stand ground, right? When you're talking about heavy cavalry or infantry, that's specifically the one that can stand the ground, that is not meant there, because it's a relative concept, right? What is heavy in the ancient world is not heavy in the Middle Ages. It changes to the relative context, and it's specifically what can make you stand the ground, right? An infantry that makes it stand the ground against cavalry, it's heavy infantry, even if the majority of its troops are not armored, for example. Still, that's what makes it different. That's objectively a useful criterion to measure the thing. Now, this has nothing to do with the fact that, however, infantry at this specific point had nothing in terms of that order and drill and discipline and maneuverability capacity at all. But they were still meant to do something, and that something sometimes was enough to make cavalry win, or to even stand their ground at the point of resulting decisive against cavalry itself in these cases. Speaking of missile troops that we already hinted at, well, clearly archers formed part of the Scottish army. It's just we do not know how many they were, and even in here I don't think that the proportion with other European armies was different at all, right? There were a few. Normally, I don't know, missile troops might have been, there were certain countries that made more or less use of them en masse, but speaking of this, I don't know the numbers, but it could have been 1 to 5, 1 to 10, something like that. And that is important, right? And especially where there is other missile troops and infantry, but even cavalry, as especially the English example eventually presents as a thing. And the lowland, we speak of Scottish archers a bit like I wanted to say actually another thing before, that is the segmentation even from a geographical base. I mean, the lowlanders in Scotland were the bulk of Scottish armies altogether. Of course, these were the most developed areas, the best equipped, also the most influenced by the same Anglo-Norman tradition. I mean, historically speaking, there aren't major differences in Britain in that regard. And in fact, they wouldn't look any different from their English counterparts. However, there is no mention of a shield or targe for Scottish infantry. Scholars say this is the case because the pikemen used to, first of all, to use both hands to handle the unwieldy weapon, the pike. But telling the truth, shields could be worn even on your shoulder, right, covering your side, and being sideways in a way, holding the pike and still using the shield in a way. Knowing that there were also troops elsewhere, and I presume in Scotland as well, that could, as we were saying before, even throw the pike at some point past to swords or axes or whatever, having the shield like that. Others say it's because pikemen in this very thick array were, like, for example, the Flemish did. They all basically intertwined their arms with the men next to them. So at that point, yeah, it does become a bit prohibitive to use the shield. But who knows? Maybe they wore it on their back and pass in hands or in arm for fighting. So I don't like, honestly, that kind of explanation. It's just that, however, objectively, yeah, there's no mention of shield or targe, whatever. There was, as we were saying before, an important supply line provided by the Low Countries and Hanseatic towns to Scotland and to Britain in general. This is a constant, up to the Renaissance. That's where most of the artillery or even the horses would come from. So Britain had particularly much in that regard. So these connections, and especially, that would remain always important in a way, for reasons also that are of political rivalry sometimes with England. At least the Flanders were eventually, as you know, allied with English during the 100 Years' War. But I don't know, the Hanseatic towns made a bit of blackmail with the English. Sometimes said, if you don't trade with one of us, we stop trading with you altogether. So that was definitely not convenient for England. There were then the Highlanders. We know of men from Argyll, Kintyre, the Western Isles, at Bannockburn, and the traditions of a score Highland clans assert their presence there too. And the Highlanders fought in King Robert's division at Bannockburn, and it is probable that, however different the Highlands were traditionally from the lowlands, they fought in the same identical way, right? The myth that, I don't know, in the mountains there are less pikemen because of the rugged ground doesn't mean anything. Like, it's a completely meaningless statement. It has never existed. It has to do with they fought in the same exact way. Certain proportions might have existed, of course, differently from simply troops availability. Usually, actually, infantry is more important than the mountains, but for even just demographic reasons, like the fact that there are less resources locally, so the young men do not have what to live, and they go abroad fighting as troops, and they're just poor people, so they're not knights or whatever, even though the word knights did the same. But as far as the composition of a Highlander or a Lowlander army was concerned, I mean, they were the same. In terms of infantry, they had their pikemen, lancers, archers in the same way. Also, regarding the training altogether, we were saying before that there was probably an increase in professionalism throughout all this time, and there were smaller bands that would become larger over time. of drilled troops, of professionals, were also better equipped mercenaries that would also live of loot and of praise of war, also in terms of equipment and so on. And even in there, as we were saying, there's not a dramatic difference with the English armies either. It's just that the Scots were, as we've seen, on average poorer. That's it. So they asked less from a material point of view, simply that. But in terms of techniques or equipment or whatever, we're talking basically about the same thing. In any case, Bruce's army was a pretty good one. You know, in terms of chain of command, it was very effective. The structure altogether held pretty well, right? He knew how to impose his will on the army, so that's great. So coming briefly back on Scottish archers, the Scots seem to have been deficient in archers before Robert Bruce's day. Even about this, I'm not entirely sure, honestly. Also because archery, yes, it's technically one of the most readily available forms of troops. Good archers is something different, but Britain had actually a good tradition here and there. The same English actually probably had some of the finest archers out there. And no, it has nothing to do with the Welsh. I mean, it's not that the Welsh were less, but there is this myth that we talked about, and we have to talk again about, that the Welsh supposedly spread the use of longbowmen and archery in general in English armies. It's completely false. There is no historical evidence of any possible sort about this. English archers had always been there, had even been paid consistently more than the Welsh ones throughout all that time. In fact, also that in later times a lot of Welsh would participate to English armies en masse as longbowmen doesn't mean anything about the intrinsic quality of English, Welsh, or Scottish, or even Irish at some point, even though archery in Ireland has been portrayed even in there as a bit less, let's say, widespread. But I personally don't think there was this great deal of difference, especially with Scotland. As you know, during the 100, I mean, it is true, because here we're talking about a matter of evidence, and you don't have to be tricked by evidence, because it's not that something, there is no evidence before means that there is some structural reason aside from documentary reasons that for which archery should have been less in Scotland than elsewhere in Britain. Maybe, right? Altogether, maybe, but still, I don't think it is the case. It's mostly, if it is the case, it's just a political social problem. It's not because Scottish archery altogether was less of a thing then. Maybe the English actually had, especially the monarchy itself, had boosted. We've seen since we made a video on English infantry during the 13th century, especially towards the end, boosted this and incentivized archery. Yes, they did, in the same English communities actually. But yeah, I mean it's as if it was an artificial thing compared to a pre-existing situation. Again, I don't think the Scottish archer was necessarily less advanced on average than the English one. And if the Scots had less archers before the time of the Bruce, well, it might have simply been for political, social reasons before the military ones. There is, however, an interesting instance of this change provided by the barony of Manor in Tweeddale, which formed one knight's fee and was to provide, instead of a knight, 10 archers. So that fee was specifically destined to missile troops, and the proportion here is nice because it's 1 to 10, which speaks, in my opinion, for actually a pre-existing quality of Scottish archery, because 10 archers are not 10 spearmen normally in the rest of Europe, right? 1 to 10, was the allegedly, but that's very theoretical, and most of the times wrong, actually, from a historical point of view, ratio of what was like considered the quality of a knight compared to the number of regular infantrymen. Well, as we were saying before, a regular infantryman was a stopping melee trooper, right? A spear and shield. Heavy infantry, technically. archers are light infantry. They're basically skirmishers. Well, the fact that these archers, this 1 to 10 is equated not to spearman, but knight spearman, but knight archer, speaks actually for good archery there. And it's, in my opinion, a hint of good archery in Scotland. Bruce definitely was aware of the danger posed by the English longbowmen, and he surely intended to counter the threat with a sizable force of his own. So there is definitely even in here an artificial positive intention to achieve that, right? And archers were drawn mostly from the borders and southern Scotland in the main, though we know, of course, that the bow was in use in the Highlands as well. Scottish archers were equipped with longbow too. Of course, longbow does not exist, has never existed. It's just a bow like any other, right? Except it's larger because the guy who used it was larger. That's the single only definition of longbow. For the rest, European bows are done in one way and one way only. Longbows have literally nothing that distinguishes them from any other bow. The yew staves, even here, probably being imported via the Hanseatic ports, which is yet also another proof of how that kind of material was thought elsewhere to be fit for that specific, to create the specific weapon. There is an interesting longbow depicted on a West Highland grave slab at Archery. And as we were saying before, there is no evidence of any sort that Scottish bows were any different from the English ones, from the Welsh ones, or that there was a lack even just of them. It's just how these armies were composed for whichever political, social reason it was. It was not because archery was different substantially in Scotland from other places. Then we can speak for blunt weapons, or at least traumatic weapons, to say better. In Scotland, there is this tradition of axes that we were recalling before since Pictish times. I made a video, if I'm not wrong, on Pictish tactics that speaks about this, and albeit not specifically about the axemen. We'll have to make a video specifically on that. And there are specific types that are documented actually a bit later compared to the 14th century, but they were there also because the evolution, the evolutive lines are pretty much clear, and even here, not a dramatic difference from other European countries. But thinking of the Jedburgh or Jedart axes, the Lochaber axe especially was the favored weapon of the Highlanders, and the Jedart axe was a similar pole arms, was used with great effect in the lowlands as well, right? Some of these had hooks similar to grab literally the knights down, similar to other weapons were developed, other pole arms were developed in Europe, and it had a bit always exists in that way, but they could also pierce with the point, the upper point of the axe, and chop naturally. But just the thing, double hand could deliver this dramatic force. It could cause pretty serious trauma under armor, even without breaking it, or making force actually in the joints of the armor to break it and to open the tin and kill the guy inside. The tin can, I meant, as a metaphor. And we are pretty certain that battles like Bannockburn, substantial, I'd say, quantity, a proportion of Scots fought with these weapons, interspersed, as we were saying before, among pikemen, or maybe, ready to pass in the corridors between the various, the various units, and maybe in the rear of the pikemen, or just even in the same phalanx, but in the rear. That is, if, as it happened actually, an English knight broken through the line, so the pikemen couldn't stop them. This knight would be stopped at some point, and there needed to be effective weapons to wound the horse's hooves, to hook these guys, to grab them down. It was a very physical thing. Very, they would hug them and bring them down with the weight. It was brutal, right? And to kill them, eventually taking them prisoner or whatever. And in fact, Barber mentions fighters who, quote, shoot out of their formation, stab horses, right? As we were saying before, there, yes, with falchions or with knives simply, and also bring men down, that really hook them and take them down. Once again, this was done also by other European, by all the Europeans, except the Scots have this more kind of axe tradition that is definitely fascinating and speaks for a pretty damn brutal warfare that was out there. And as we were saying before, these are weapons that that are very different from a pike. Functionally speaking, the pike is unwieldy, so in order to attack a knight, you can use, aside from these pole arms and axes, also swords, daggers, and so on. But when it's stopped, right? Otherwise, you're gonna simply get smashed by the charge, because cavalry, by definition, cannot defend, right? So when it stops, it's vulnerable. And these weapons would be more suited to close quarter fighting. And that's pretty much it. Alright, so I am glad we talked about this. This is a video that I told you I had prepared before I went away 10 days ago, and we began to speak again about this stuff. And I was glad specifically about the topic, because honestly, these are my favorite videos, and that's why also yesterday I was telling you maybe we can increase a bit the incidence of them. It takes a bit longer to prepare them, but they're cool and I like doing them, so you can intersperse maybe more Formkrieger videos, but for the rest, I think we can easily talk about this stuff. And as you know, this type of videos are meant to cover basically every single type of trooper in medieval Europe. We're doing this also for the ancient world, at least as far from the Hellenistic times. So from Hellenistic times to the Renaissance, and at some point we could expand further. So, but it's really a lot of stuff. So at least about Scottish infantry was really very important to talk, because you understood the reasons, especially at the beginning of the video, to understand how these guys didn't really have a dramatic edge from a technical point of view of sort. It's just moral strength, which is the single, from our Clausewitzian studies, we know it's the single most important relative factor in war. It's not it doesn't ensure you to win, but it's really still the most important thing in relative terms, at least for the Scots on multiple occasions, further in their own history worked in this century. And we will talk, of course, as we were saying before as well, about Scottish warfare. We will make a video on Scottish military organization at this time. Then we'll do it, of course, also for the previous centuries, the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and equally for tactics, right? So at least other 6 videos about that, and other types of Scottish fighters throughout all that. So it's plenty of stuff, right? And for now, I stop here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.